We're on Daf Memches Amud Aleph, the last line on the Amud. Amar Rav. Now, this statement of Rav is going to address the opinion that the shear of Isa for Afias Matzah is similar and perhaps even identical to the Chiyuv Challah, an equation between the shear of Matzah and the shear of Challah. Kaba milogna'a lepischa v'chein lachallah. One kav of melagana, he says, is makom sheshmo, that's its name. And the maximum amount with regard to this kneading of the dough on Pesach is that measure called a kav. And the reason for that shear is because you can protect it from becoming chametz. V'chein lachallah, and that same shear of the kav of melagona is the shear for the chiyuv challah. So that when you have that amount of a dough, you're obligated to be mafresh challah. Now, I don't know if this is a simon ledavar or a siba ledavar, meaning, is it true that there's some sort of connection between the two? Intuitively, I would say no, it's just a simon ledavar. It happens to be the same shear, but that's coincidental. In one case, when we're dealing with the amount of and the size of a dough for kneading purposes so that you can protect it from being chametz, we saw that there were many distinctions. There was a dough that's made of wheat, a dough that's made of barley. There was superior dough, barley, and inferior barley, etc., etc. So there were many different elements that went into the equation. And it's all a question of to what extent we have to be worried about the fact that he or she won't be able to keep the kneading going of the saskus until finally it became chametz. Challah has its own shear, and the Mishnah that we're about to learn is going in Masechet Challah is going to establish the shear of Challah. And again, I would submit to you right now until I'm proven guilty that this is just merely a coincidental overlap. I don't see why the issue of becoming chametz or not becoming chametz should have anything to do with the shear of challah, because the shear of challah is called reishis harisos seichem. And for example, when you talk about challah, it makes no difference whether you're baking it as a bread, or you're baking it as chametz, or you're baking it as matzah. That's irrelevant to the chiyuv of challah. Masha'enkein, if you're talking about the shear of letting her, knead the dough and being able to supervise and guarantee that it won't become chametz, that's an issue of chametz versus matzah. In challah, that there's no issue of chametz versus matzah. So let's now look at the Mishnah in challah, which is here on the top of Memches Amud Beis. Chameshes revoim kemach vi'od. Now we're talking about a dough that has 1 1/4 kabim of flour, which is chameshes revoim kemach. So 5/5, which is the same as 1 1/4. That's the amount of flour, and you add, of course, the water to the flour to make the dough. Once you have that amount of flour, 1 1/4 kabin, and hopefully by the end of today, or if not, the end of Sunday, we'll figure out how much is 1 1/4 kabin in our measurements. That's enough to generate a chiyuv challah. So the Torah tells us in Parshas Shlach, reishis harisos seichem torimu truma, and that shear of Isa of reishis harisos seichem is derived in the Gemara in Eruvin as Kidei Iso Sechem, which means the Isa of the Midbar. So in the Midbar, they needed from the man an Omer La Gilgolas, which is in Parshas Bishalach. And there the Torah says, the Omer Asiris HaEphah. Now, how much is an Asiris HaEphah? The Ephah is equal to Shalosh Se'in, and each Sa'ah that makes up these three Se'in to make up an Asiris HaEphah is 6 Kavim. Now, a Kav is equal to 4 Lugim. So 6 Kavim, therefore, is 24 Lugim. And then we're saying that shear of 24 Lugim is Asiris HaEphah. The Ephah is 72 Lugim, which is equal to 72 Revai Kav. The Omer is Asiris HaEphah, and the shear is 7 1/5 Lug. Then they came to Eretz Yisrael, and in Yerushalayim they added another 6, which is called Shishis Milabar. All this is in the Sugyan Erevin, which is 1/5 Milago. So they added 1 Chelek Echad Michamisha Chalakim Me'amida, and after they added it, it's a shishis from the entire mixture, which means 6 kavim midbarim became 5 kavim Yerushalmim. So the Shira Omer now is Shisha Lugim Yerushalmim. Then they got to a place called Tzipori, and there they added to the midos another 6 milabar, which became 6 Lugim Yerushalmim, which is equivalent to 5 Lugim Tziporiim. And that's what it means that the Isa is 5 Revai Kav Kemach, a Kav and a Reva, which is the equivalent of 5 Lugim is Chayiv and Chal. Okay, if you followed all of that, you're a genius. But basically, this is a summary of the Sugya and Erevin to establish the shear of Challah. So now we have the following problem. On the one hand, we said in the name of Rav that the shear of Challah is equivalent to a kav of Melogna. On the other hand, we're saying, based on the Mishnah, that the shear of Challah is 1.25 kavim. So is it a kav or is it 1.125? So the Gemara answers Hachikam, and this is what Rav had in mind. Kaba milognoi nami ahai shirakoi, which means that the kav of milogna is equal to this measurement of the Mishnah of 5/4 of a kav. Rav just gave it a siman l'davar so that we would know exactly how to identify it. Amar Rav Yossi. Now, it seems that the ladies were more machmir with regard to Pesach because they were afraid of Challah, and therefore they took smaller amounts of dough in order to bake matzah. They would guarantee with the smaller amounts that they were able to keep up the kneading, this askus, and it wouldn't become chametz. And you and I would have said that's a good thing for the Jews. Amar Rav Yosef, Hani Nashi Didan Noig Lemefa Kpiza Kviza Lepischa. There was a certain utensil that was called a kpiza, and it had a receptacle for shlosha lugim, for 3 lugim. And every time that they poured the kemach into this kpiza, they ended up with 3 lugim. And this was the chumrah of using a smaller amount to create a smaller isa to prevent it from becoming chametz. And again, as you and I would have said, that's a good thing for the Jews because this is a chumrah of 3/4 of a cow rather than 1.25, right? 1.25. And that's going to guarantee us that there's no chimutz. But you know, Rabbosai, sometimes the chumrah doesn't pay off, even from a halachic perspective. Abai says, Rav Yosef, that's very nice that you are encouraging the ladies apparently to accept upon themselves the stringency, but chumrah diosile de kulahu. It's very nice that as far as chimutz is concerned, it's a chumrah. But on the other hand, the flip side of the coin is that it's a kula with regard to challah. Why? To kamafkala michallah. By using this smaller shear for baking their matzahs, they are circumventing the chiyuv of challah. That's called being mafkia the isa from mitzvah of challah. And that's not a good thing. L'chatchila, this is based on the Yerushalmi and Challah. Ein lasos isa pchusa mishir challah. We don't deliberately bake a dough that is smaller than the shear of challah. Fotra mitzvahs challah. It reminds me of tzitzis. Like we don't deliberately wear a beged that doesn't have 4 kanfas, so that we're circumventing the chiyuv of tzitzis. We don't try to avoid a mitzvah. And that's what the Yerushalmi establishes in Masechet Challah. Therefore, Abai objects to Rav Yosef. Why are we encouraging the women to take upon this chumrah when in effect they are now avoiding the chiyuv of Challah? Amalei, Rav Yosef responds, no, you're missing the point. They will have the benefits of both. They'll have a chumrah and chametz without avoiding the chiyuv Challah. How is that so? The Avdan Rabbi Eliezer, they're going to do it in a way that reflects the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. This is what's called tziruf sal. Have you ever heard of it? It's a very, again, I'm not a baki in Challah. I mean, I heard shiur from the Rav in Challah, but that was so many years ago. But tziruf sal means that even if in the baking process you have less than a shear of chiyuv challah, you can still be mitzarev smaller loaves by putting them together on a single surface. Now, again, I'm not sure exactly what that sal is. That's what our sugya is going to address. For example, we're going to have a machlokus in our Gemara soon coming around the bend, whether it's enough to put it on a flat surface or you need a surface that has rims that go up. But in any event, Rabbi Eliezer was the father or the originator of this shita called tziruf sal. So that even though they were kneading and baking smaller challahs in order to guarantee that it wouldn't become chametz, they didn't avoid the chiyuv challah because after the baking process, when there's no longer a problem of fermentation, you have your matzah, they would add them together in a chsal. And by putting them together in one surface or one basket, we'll call it, they were able to join the smaller shiurim into one shear of challah. The Chachamim disagree because the Chachamim hold that the tziruf has to be either in the dough, the isa, or in the latest point, at the point of tanur, at the point of afiyah. If you bake smaller amounts of dough, then you're potter from challah. You can't create a chiyuv challah after afiyah. And again, this touches on a fundamental issue in challah, where the challah has only one machayev or 2 machayev. It certainly has one machayev of reishis harisol seichem that's explicit in the pasuk. Is there another machayev of ma'aseh tanur, that the afiyah and maybe even subsequent to the afiyah, you could have many smaller amounts that were baked together, and if you mitzaref them in the sal, that's enough to generate a brand new chiyuv challah. And some of the nafkaminus would be, let's say he went ahead and he was mafresh the challah when it was in a state of dough, but it was smaller than the shear of chiyuv challah. So he only has one machayiv, and that's the isa, and the isa is too small to generate a chiyuv challah. That hafrasha is completely null and void. Disnan, we learned in a Mishnah in the second parak of Challah, and now we're talking about a case of a person who makes small isos. And they're multiple, but they don't have a shear of chiyuv challah. But now he can mitzarif them together, all these smaller doughs, to generate a chiyuv challah. And each one of these doughs made contact one with the other. So there was some level of tziruf tanur, of tziruf afir. The Tanna Kama says that's not enough. The fact that these two doughs, or as many as there are, touched each other, the touching of each other is not enough to be mitzarif them into one isa and generate a chiyuv challah. We need what's called sheishoku. Sheishoku means sheidavku zeh im zeh. They have to actually be connected in such a way that if you would now try to separate them and rip them apart, you would see that part of it is ripped from the other part. But Rabbi Eliezer Omer, he has a different opinion, and he says that haroda, meaning when he takes the dough out of the oven, and they're already been baked, these smaller amounts and smaller loaves, but no stola sal, he puts them all into one basket, and as a result, hasal mitzarfon lechala, which means that although in the oven he baked them without a shear of challah, but when he removes them from the oven, which is called redias hapas, and he puts them into one basket, and when all these loaves are placed into one basket immediately when they're removed from the oven, this is going to be a major issue in the Rishonim. How long of a period of time do we allow him for tziruf sal after he takes it out of the oven? But just to make life easier for ourselves at this point, let's assume immediately after he removed them from the oven, he put them together in one sal, is hasal mitzarfon lit, let's say the word shir chal. And therefore, even though the isa would not have been large enough to generate a chiyuv challah, and each lechem that was baked from that small isa would not be chayiv and challah, nevertheless he can recreate or begin to generate a chiyuv challah from the moment of tziruf sal, which is post afir. And not only that, Omer Rabbi Yehuda Mishma halacha Rabbi Eliezer, we actually accept the halacha like Rabbi Eliezer of tziruf sal. Therefore, the noshim who would do this afia of small lechamim using a kpiza, which is only shlocha lug, in order to be machmir and avoid any sort of chimus, they did not avoid the chiyuv of chal because after it came out of the oven, they would put it together in a sal. So the Gemara asks the following question: Amalei Abai turns to Rav Yossi, says, "Vayitmar Allah." It may be true that you could rely on the Shita Rabbi Eliezer, but Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi lo shanu, we don't accept Rabbi Eliezer of tziruf sal for a chiyuv challah, ella kikros shel bavel shenoshchos zo mizo, which means that when he put these various smaller doughs into the oven, they were wider doughs, round, wide doughs, and they were noshchos zo mizo. And because of the round and wide size or shape of the isos, they were able to have in contact one with the other. They would bite each other literally, if you translate it literally. So these are the loaves of Bavel. If I stop it, I know I'm going to mess it up.
Okay, you're not stopping.
Okay, then? So again, I'm going back to the question of these Babylonian loaves that we spoke about. Yes, they are wide and round. which are called rechavos the agulos. And in such a case, what happens is in the oven, they stick to each other firmly. That's called biting each other, such that if you pulled apart one piece from the other, they still remain attached to each other, or some of it remains attached. That's when we can apply the principle of tziruf sal. So it means that the mechayev of challah is not an original, an initiative that begins after the afiyah. It's got to begin in the oven itself. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon Levi says that Rabbi Eliezer's halacha, which we accept, applies when there is already a tziruf in the tanur before the sal, and we're gonna integrate A plus B equals C. C is the tziruf, and we're gonna integrate two elements. One is the relationship between the doughs as they bite each other, so to speak. That's called noshcho zomizu in the oven. And number two, to indicate that we really want all these to be together, we're going to have what we call a tziruf sal. So the tziruf sal, therefore, is the culmination, and this was common practice in Bavel, of the neshicha of noshcha zumizu that took place in the oven itself. Aval ke'achin lo. Achin means instead of rechavos and agulos, we're talking about aruchim vitzarim. So they weren't round, but rather they were in a long shape, and they were very narrow. They weren't wide like a round dough. And therefore, there's no neshicha zomizu lo. The sal is not mitzarfa. And I'll read to you the language of the note here. He writes, Kidei litzarfon l'chala tzorach gam sheinoshchu zeh mizeh batanur, the gam, and then afterwards, sheyu besal echad. But these matzos that the women folk, as Rav Yosef testified, were baking, were not in a round, wide shape, but rather in a relatively narrow, long shape, and therefore they were enon noshcho zomizu. So the tziruf sal afterwards would not generate a chiyuv challah. So Abai says, once again, the minhag of women to bake these doughs with a shlosha rivei kav is not a good minhag because they're being mafkir themselves from the mitzvah of challah. And the Gemara answers, Rav Yosef says to Abai, in Marallah, we have another opinion, and this is not Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, but rather Rabbi Chanina's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, and that is afilu ke'achin. Even if there's no neshicha zumizu inside the oven, nevertheless the sal is mitzaref as an independent mitzaref, and it generates a chiyuv challah post afiyah. And that means that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, in this interpretation, you could be mitzaref them for challah. You don't need that you have a connection between the doughs already in the oven, so that when you remove it from the oven, you're really removing one dough because they're noshcho sumisu. That's not necessary. So the minhag of the women, as far as preparing matzahs for Pesach, reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Chanina, not the one of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Now, in the note here, he says that we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, but he says that bismanenu, in our times, kulanu tmei mesim v'nitmei ha'isa. The assumption is for sure that the Isa became Tmeya. It came in contact with Tamei Mes. And therefore the Challah is Challah Tmeya, and the Kohen can't eat the Challah. And therefore, our minhag is, in our time, She'ofen Isa Shel Pesach, Noagim shemechalkim es habotzek l'shtei chatichos, achas gedola, v'yesh la ma'at hochos mishir chiyuv chal, v'achas ketana, v'ofesh shteim, uksheroda otsa me'atanur nostam betoch kli shemitzarfam l'chala, notel es haktana v'korya la shem chala mevorech al afrashasa umatzniya, v'sarfa b'motzei yontif. So if they do this on yontif, they have to do the burning process after yontif or anytime later. That means that we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah back on Daf Mem Vav, that if you bake an Isa Tmei on Yontif on Pesach, you should not be Kori Shem Chala on any of the Chatichos before the Afir, because if he does so, then he's doing a Malach of Afir Shalol Litzorech Ochel Nefesh. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now, remember I indicated to you before that it's not clear exactly what this sal, in the context of Rabbi Eliezer's tziruf sal, exactly looks like. And that's really the issue that Rabbi Yirmiyah vacillates about. Tavla is a flat surface. We call it a board, like a cutting board or something along that line. She'ein la levizvizin mahu. Levizvizin means a misgeret shel safa misviva. In other words, we're talking about a flat board that doesn't have any sort of a rim around it. Ma'u, what's the din? Do we have tziruf for challah, for the chiv challah, or not? And now Rabbi Yirmiyah analyzes the suffix. He says, toch kli ba'inon? Do we need that both of these breads should be inside the kli, so that you have the rim that surrounds the kli and now surrounds the two lachamim that are in the kli, valeka? But here, in the case of a tavla, we don't have such a thing, because the tavla has no toch, which has, again, implications in Hilchos Tumah V'Tara, but that's not what we're learning now. O Dilma Avir Kli Be'ina. All we need is that we have two lachamim that share the same avir of the kli, not the toch of the kli, and therefore the tavla would be mitzarfa ika. Teku. This is so typical of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah always comes up with the tekus. The Gemara now presents another shita regarding tziruf isos lechala. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, hasal mitzarfan. Only the sal could combine these smaller loaves into a shear of challah to mechayiv challah, whereas Rabbi Yeshua Omer, tanur mitzarfan. In other words, you don't need to put them together in a sal in one single basket. It says Rabbi Yeshua, I have another tziruf, a mitzaref, and that is the tanur itself, which means that according to Rabbi Yeshua, the very fact that they don't bite each other, that are connected to each other, they're separate doughs, but they're placed into the same oven, the oven itself is mitzaref. Now again, you could look at that as a chumrah, because it creates a chiyuv challah, or you could look at it as a kula, because we were eager to be makayim the mitzvah of challah. According to this opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, the whole issue about the noshim that Abaye was objecting to the minhag that Rabbi Yosef recorded is completely irrelevant, because who cares if they baked smaller amounts of dough in order to guarantee that they won't become chametz? The very moment they put it into the tanur, that itself is mitzaref. However, the truth is that many Rishonim say that these women only activated the oven with one dough at a time. They were afraid that if you have too many doughs at the same time, the doughs might combine and create chimetz even before the afiyah. Again, it's a big chumrah. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Kikros shel bavel shenosha zu mitzarfos. He is the most makil, in a sense, meaning he raises the bar and the conditions, the standards for that are required in order to generate a chiyuv challah. And he's going to say in all those cases that were mentioned by Rabbi Eliezer of Yeshua, you're part of challah, because what you absolutely need is neshicha. It's not enough that you put different doughs that are separate from each other into the oven and bake them simultaneously, as Rabbi Yeshua would be mitzaref them. It's not enough that you put them all in a sal after they're baked, as Rabbi Eliezer would be mitzaref them. You need that the dough themselves have to bite one from the other, and then you have a tziruf for chal. However, we have to point out that this shita of Rav Shimon Gamliel is also a machmir, because he's going to tell us that if they're noshcho zu, then you don't need the tziruf of sal. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer would hold it's not enough to have noshcho zu. You need a tziruf sal, because the noshcho zu is only mitzarif them as far as the tanur is concerned, but not, they didn't have the tziruf neither as a dough before they were placed into the oven, nor were they put together in one sal. So that here we have Rabbi Shimon, who's telling us that no, you can have a tziruf of noshcho zu without putting them together in one sal. Now, where is the kula of Rabbi Shimon? Let's say you had those long, narrow doughs that don't bite one from each other, that placed one above the other in a line, in a row in the oven. Then Rabbi Shimon would say, even if you take them out of the oven and immediately put them into one basket, they're not chayiv and chal. So that there's a twofold machlokus here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Eliezer, on the one hand, would be mechayiv and chal simply because of tziruf sal. And not only that, whereas Rabbi Shimon would say no. On the other hand, Rabbi Shimon would hold that if you have noshcho zu, that itself is an automatic mechayev and a mitzaref, whereas Rabbi Eliezer would say no, you need one of two things, either a tziruf in the isa, or if the isa is not large enough, you need a tziruf sal. Let me just see before we start the new Mishnah for today. Just want to see. Oh, he has a note here, and I'm not sure who this is. Maybe you know. It's called Rabbeinu Moshe mi-Imran. Anybody know who he was? First time I'm encountering. And this Rabbeinu Moshe says the following: that Rab Shimon Gamliel ba lomar tanur kevan she'ein notzin bo es hakikros kedei litzarfon el kedei lafoson eno mitzarfos ad shoku. According to Rabbi Rabbeinu Moshe, the words of Rabbi Shimon are being addressed to Rabbi Yeshua, not the way we interpret it. Rabbi Yeshua said that you can have a tziruf of tanur, and if you place these smaller kikros into one oven and bake them simultaneously, that's enough to be mitzaref them. Comes along Rabbi Shimon and he says no. The purpose of putting them together in a tanur was not for the purpose of tziruf, but rather for the purpose of afiyah, simply to bake them together. That's not enough to be mitzaref them. However, says Rabbeinu Moshe, again against the way we interpret it, that Reb Shimon Gamliel would agree that the sal is a meaningful tziruf, even in the absence of neshicha, which means that according to this interpretation of Reb Shimon, everything depends upon his intention. Again, I don't believe it's just the physical intention, but it means the way normally you do it. So putting them together at the same time in the oven, according to Reb Shimon, against Rabbi Yeshua is not a mitzaref because that's just the process of afiyah. Let's say it this way: it's economically or from an engineering point of view, it is beneficial to put all these small kikros into the oven at the same time, but that's not done for the purpose of tzir. If, on the other hand, after the baking process, you take out these smaller kikros and you put them all into one sal for the purpose of being mitzaref them, you want to gain that you offer them together in one kli, whether it's toch or not toch, avir. That is a mitzaref according to Rabbi Shimon. Ula Rabbi Eliezer, afilu noshchu betanur tzorich tziruf sal. Meaning that whereas Rabbi Shimon says that putting them in the oven at the same time, that's not a mitzaref, that's just an afiyah process. But if you put them in a way with round and thick dough so that you know there'll be an ashicha zumizu, then that's enough of a mitzaref. Comes along Rabbi Eliezer and he says, no, nashchu b'tocha tanur, that's not enough to be mitzaref. Then we need in addition a tziruf sal. All right, now we begin the new Mishnah. Now, our Mishnah here is going to address the case where many different women are baking matzahs on Pesach in the same oven. They share the same oven. And it's relatively a small oven. And therefore, some of the Tanoim are going to require Bazecher said that we will not allow Leah and Rachel to put their respective doughs into the small oven simultaneously. Leah is going to have to wait till after Rachel finishes. Shalosh noshim loshos ke'achas. According to Rabbi Gamliel, we don't have to be bothered by the fact that many different doughs are going to the oven and sharing the oven simultaneously. The ofas b'tanur echad, and they can bake in one oven. But he says, zoachar zo. Now, on the one hand, he says, shalosh noshim loshos ke'achas, which means at one time, that's only as far, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. That's only as far as Lisha is concerned. Great. Now, what's the chiddush of Loshim Ka'achas? I don't think there's a chiddush in that. There's no problem if each woman is kneading her own dough. But it's a lead up to the next point. Now they've all completed simultaneously the kneading of their doughs, each one respecting, and now they want to also bake it together. The lisha together is not a problem because each one is doing her own lisha. But what about the afiyah together? And that's where Rabbi Gamliel says that we're not going to allow a simultaneous afiyah of multiple doughs because since there's a possibility that the oven, in other words, if you bake one batch of dough at the same time, at a time, and then another batch, so that's fine. But if you have many doughs going into the oven at the same time, then we're afraid that when Leah waits for her turn to put the dough into the oven, so in the meantime, it takes another few seconds, she might terminate her process of kneading the dough and it may become Chametz. Let me read to you his explanation of Rabbi Gamliel. He says, Af she belishas, right, in the process of kneading, so the second woman or the third woman, mamtenes lafos achar shtei chavroseha, he's talking about the third woman, So in other words, I guess there's not enough room in the tanur to bake them all simultaneously. So by letting them each knead the dough at the same time, and then they're going to have to wait for that turn to use the oven and bake that dough, maybe at that point we should be afraid that the botzek, the dough, would become chametz. And the chiddush of Rav Gamliel is that we can allow this to go on. So it's not the way I told you that it's a chumrah that he's not allowing all three of them to bake simultaneously in the same oven. No, no, no. There's not enough room in the oven for all three of them to bake. The chiddush is that we're going to allow them to knead each one the dough at the same time. And since there's not enough room for more than one dough to be baked at the same time, they're going to have to continue kneading the dough up until that very last minute when they put the dough, when their turn comes around, into the oven to bake it. And you might have thought that we should be choshesh, we should be afraid that as Leah is waiting for Rachel to remove her dough, Leah, will stop for a moment, momentarily, and at that point, when she stops kneading the dough, it becomes chametz. So therefore, we have to assume, says Rabbi Gamliel, that they are all very diligent, and they will continuously knead the dough up until the moment that it's their turn to put the dough into the oven. That's the kula here of Rabbi Gamliel, and we're not afraid that while she is waiting for her turn, she will allow the chametz, the botzek, to become chametz. The chachamim omrim, they're not excited about this situation.
It's a problem.
To allow the lisha to take effect. That's not the word I want to use. To allow the lisha process to be implemented of three doughs simultaneously, a lisha of three doughs simultaneously, when the afia is going to be bazecher zeh. El sholosh noshim oskos bebatek achas. We're not going to allow the women to knead their doughs at the same time, but rather each dough, each batek has to be kneaded together and then placed into the oven together. Is achas losha. So while one of them is kneading the dough, and that dough is going to be the first one to place into the oven, Leah, the second one, is oreches. She is organizing the dough, but she's not ready for lisha. No. This doesn't make any sense. I'm assuming that oreches is a process that precedes lisha. That's a mistake. It works like this. There are three processes. There's lisha, aricha, and afir. And it goes in that sequence. So when Rachel, who's first online, is no, she's really last online. What I mean to say is, let's say Rachel, Leah, and Chana. So Chana starts at T1 with Lisha, goes on to T2 of Aricha, and now she's ready for time T3 to place the dough in the oven. Leah is behind her, and she's at time T2, meaning she's past Lisha, she's at the stage of Aricha, and then by the time she is ready for Afia, Chana, who is first on the list, she's already removing the the dough that's already been baked, the matzah from the oven, and now Leah could immediately follow her after Leah completes her aricha and does the afiyah. Now, at this point, while Leah is doing the aricha, Rachel is at the early stage. She's doing the lisha. So she will constantly be involved in lisha until she goes to the next step of aricha. And aricha, I guess, when you shape, you do the radling or whatever you do, and now it gets a shape. So that's also a hisaskus that's going to prevent chimutz until, with this rotation system, it's Rachel's turn, following lisha and aricha, to put the dough into the oven. Let me just read the note that I have over here. Just give me 1 minute and then the floor is yours. He says the following, that according to Chachamim, 3 women are occupied with dough at one time, but they follow the following procedure. In other words, we're not going to allow them to knead their dough, all 3 of them at the same time. While one woman kneads her dough, another one shapes her dough, and the third one bakes her dough. There are 3 stages in the process of converting dough into bread. First, the dough is kneaded, and it's shaped into loaves, and finally it's baked. Each of these stages take approximately the same amount of time. So the Chachamim say that only one woman is kneading her dough at a time. After the first woman has finished kneading her dough, she's about to move forward to the second stage of shaping it, aricha. Another woman now, who's behind her, we'll call her Leah, she's beginning to knead her dough. Then the first woman, we called Chana, finished shaping her dough. She's ready now to bake the dough. And at this point, the second woman, we called her Leah, she's already finished kneading the dough. And now she's involved in shaping the dough. Now we're ready, when Leah is up to the point of shaping the dough, aricha, now we're ready to invite Rachel, the third woman online, to begin kneading the dough. Very good. Staggering. That's the word I needed. By staggering the work in this manner, the Chachamim ensure that each dough will be manipulated the entire time until it is baked, and thus it will not become chametz. Yeah, Rabbi, the floor is yours. Sorry, I just wanted to finish.
I think Rashi understands the Rabbi Gamliel somewhat differently.
We're back to Rabbi Gamliel. Okay. I was trying to understand the Chachamim.
Well, once you understand Rabbi Gamliel, the Chachamim makes more sense.
So what does Rabbi Gamliel say? Shalosh nochim lachos ka'achas. And we're not afraid that as one waits online for her turn to bake the oven, that it'll become chametz. She'll continue manipulating the dough.
No. That wouldn't be any chiddush.
No, that's a great chiddush, because
that's no chiddush at all.
Because she's waiting online,
Beseder, but there's no possibility of chimutz because they're loshing. What happened is that they all losh at the same time.
Right.
Then number one puts the butzek inside, and the other 2 are waiting. And then the second puts in, and the third puts in. And even though they're waiting 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, nevertheless, we're not choshesh. Look, read Rashi.
Just 1 second. So wait a second. The last dough that goes into the oven will have been left. I see. So it's not that she has to continuously manipulate the dough. According to Rabbi Eliezer, let the dough sit, but it's such a short period of time.
That's right.
Because the baking goes so fast, we're not afraid that it'll come to chimutz.
That's right. Okay? That's right. Read Rashi. Rashi says it beferish.
Okay, I had my pshat, but I'm hoping somebody will say my pshat. Let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, Kol achas melo hatanur. Not sure what he means by melo hatanur.
Each one fills up the tanur.
Yeah, because there's only room for one dough at a time.
That's right.
The enkan the afal pi achas mamtenes ad sheyofu ashtaim. All right, let's see if
the other person waits.
right? And
She's
she
finished,
basically
Alicia.
leaves the dough lying fallow, so to speak. But we're not
That's the
afraid
chiddush.
that'll become.
That's
Yeah.
the chiddush. And Rabban
Let me just
and
see. Just 1 second. He quotes Marit. 1 second. Let me just see. Oh, Mashma mi divrei Rashi. This is Rabbi, your point. So you were machaving to the Marit. He says, Mashma mi, on Challah, this, the Marit on Challah is very famous. It's published actually in the back of Masechet Challah. Mashma mi divrei Rashi, she'ena achas tzricha laharich, which means to continue, belisha, ad she'tisayim zu shelafanel. El afilu imhi mamtenes below asek, sover of Gamliel, she'ena isa machmitza.
right.
Okay. And then he tells you to look in the Ritva. Okay, I don't know. Maybe the Ritva will say my time. Let's go on. Now we get to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Omer, local anoshim, local eitzim, local tanurim shavim. You cannot objectify this. There are too many subjective elements and variables that go into the equation. He says, Yesh noshim atzlanios, and therefore we cannot accept Rabbi Gamliel's approach, says Rabbi Akiva, as a flat rule that they all could begin their kneading at the same time and wait until the other lady finishes her aricha and her afia. It could be that in the meantime, the chimetz process will take place. Then he says, eitzim, yesh eitzim sheinim yeveshim kol kach, they're a little bit more moist. Vinidlakim liat, and they burn very slowly. And therefore, in the interim, maybe the dough will become chametz. V'yesh tanurim, now we're up to tanurim, shemischamim bizman beruba, higon shalosh tamshu bo zman rav. So if you keep heating up the oven one after the other, then it will speed up the process of baking. But if it hasn't been used for a while, it's going to take a longer time to heat up the oven. And therefore, im achas tisayim laroch, if one of these ladies will complete her process of shaping the dough, v'tamtin, and she's going to wait until the other lady finishes baking in the oven, then in the meantime, yachmitz habatzek. And therefore, he says, Kedivrei chachamim roi lasos. The best thing is to stagger it, as the chachamim said. Zeh klal. Tofach, if a person waits until the dough becomes tofeach, and he has an English translation of the word tofeach, calls it swell. Okay, that's a good word. So that if he sees that the dough is beginning to swell, then tiltosh bitsone. What does tiltosh means? With cold water. I see. She moistens her hands. He says here in the Hebrew, tirchatz yodeh b'mayim tsonenim. And then v'tatuach b'hem es habatzek. And then she smears water over the dough. Kadeshi it's tanin v'lo yachmitz. This is what we saw, if you remember, in the previous Mishnah of Ben Beseira, that if you're afraid that this dough is going to ferment, it's become leaven, then put it into cold water in order to arrest the process of chimus. According to the Aruch, apparently, the word tiltosh doesn't refer to washing our hands, but rather lizrok bo mayim, to actually pour water on the dough. And the Tiferes Yisrael on the Mishnayos and the Yochanan Boaz, he goes into a whole etymological analysis of the word tiltosh, miloshen lotesh, like lotesh nechoshes, Shemachaded umitzachtzeh hanechoshes. And here in this context, it means Shemolech umevi yodo hamaluchleches b'mayim al habotzeg lotesh akin al ha'ever. So this is the principle of Rabbi Akiva, and the poskim actually write that the halach is like Rabbi Eliezer in the previous Mishnah, which seems to imply that we reject Ben Beseira, who says that you can take the dough and just simply put it into cold water, and that will prevent chimutz. He says, "Im klal zeh shetzonein moneas ha'isam l'hachvetzu stam Mishnah hoyalahem lifso ki Ben Beseira." So that the assumption here is that Rabbi Eliezer did not accept Ben Beseira. If it had been a Stam Mishnah without Rabbi Eliezer, then we would accept Rabbi Ben Beseira's premise that the cold water will prevent chimutz. However, he quotes a Tosfos that Gam Rabbi Eliezer model Ben Beseira, even Rabbi Eliezer would accept that eitzah of Ben Beseira to put the dough into cold water and prevent its chimutz. But rather, Rabbi Eliezer says, "L'chatchila ein lismach kol kach." We shouldn't rely on that scientific experiment. Therefore, yesh lomar sheklal zehu stam mishnah v'eino midivrei Rabbi Akiva. So that once we have a Stam Mishnah, we could say it's not Rabbi Akiva's own unique opinion that tiltosh bitzonein, but rather that is the generally accepted view, universally accepted, that soaking the dough in cold water will certainly arrest the process of